This is about creating white anti-racist learning spaces. And I have a very particular attachment to these kinds of spaces because some of my best learning has happened in anti-racist learning spaces that were all white. The first one started, I was in graduate school and it was with my partner and my sister and my sister's partner and another friend. And the five of us got together on a regular basis and we would read a book, usually by a person of color, but always about race, sometimes by white people. And we would talk about them and we would spend a lot of, like, we'd spend sometimes all of Saturday and Saturday night just talking about this, what we're learning and brainstorming and practicing. And what I found was that I needed that space in order to be able to talk, to actually talk about race in other spaces. So this is a picture of me when I was growing up in Mount Lebanon. This is me with my three siblings. And I grew up in a town that was 99.8% white. I grew up in a community where we really never talked about race. And yet, if you had asked me, like, Allie, what were some of the messages that you got about race and racism growing up? I would have the question, the first time I heard the question, it was confusing because it was like, well, I didn't get any message. I don't think I got messages about race. I mean, let me see, well, my grandpa sometimes used racial slurs. My parents didn't. So what else would there be? Like, is there another message that you could get about race? And what I didn't realize until well after I left home was the fact that we didn't talk about race was a racial message. The idea that we should be colorblind, that we shouldn't talk about race, that we shouldn't notice racial difference, that in itself was a racial message. I also grew up in an all white space. I mean, it wasn't 100% white. It was almost all white, 99.8%. And that was a racial message. One of the things that I didn't realize at the time is that all white spaces don't happen by accident. So if you have an all white space in a multiracial country like ours, there was intentional social, political policy that went in to creating that space as an all white space. Meanwhile, my parents never said, like, oh, you know what? We want to move to the suburbs because we want to be around only white people, or we like segregated spaces. And we didn't even think of it as a segregated space. I mean, if you had asked me if I grew up in a segregated community, I would have said no. There were lots of people of color in my community and we all went to the same school and we all worked together. But if I could have zoomed out in high school, what I would have seen is this almost all white space, 10 miles away from an almost all black space. And we never mixed and we never competed in sports. We didn't know each other. We didn't even have the opportunity to drink or not drink from the same water fountain. We didn't know each other. And it was highly segregated, but I didn't think of it that way because when my parents moved there, they wanted sidewalks, they wanted good schools, they wanted to be near people that they knew. And they weren't thinking in terms of race because, again, we were kind of trained not to think about race and not to name whiteness. And so for me, in my own work today, these are some of the book projects I've been involved in. I'm very interested in naming whiteness. In fact, all of my research, all of my writing focuses on whiteness, in part because I just want to figure out where I belong in conversations about race. I want to figure out what is my racial story. Because when I graduated from high school, if you had asked me how much race impacted my life, I would probably have said hardly at all. Now, what I would say is there's not a day of my life that hasn't been impacted by being white. And my studying whiteness helps me figure out what that means, helps me figure out to what extent has being white impacted every day of my life. And then the other reason I study whiteness is because I work mostly with educators. And in my experience of graduate school, I found that when we talked about race in schools of education, we basically talked about people of color, like how kids of color are doing in schools and how communities of color and what we can do in those communities. But we didn't talk about whiteness. Whiteness was not usually part of the conversation. And so it furthers, when we don't talk about whiteness, it furthers this idea that people of color have race and deal with racism, and it has nothing to do with white people. Like for me, it was like, well, my grandpa uses racial slurs, but nobody else does. It's like racism is just this overt, intentional, mean thing that people do. And as long as we don't do that, it has nothing to do with us. That was kind of the attitude that I grew up with. And what I was starting to realize, why I started to read and write about whiteness, was that what I realized was that racism is not a person of color problem. It's actually a white person problem. And this is a quote that comes from James Baldwin. He said, racism is a white person problem. It's actually not going to change until white people do something about it. So it's part of my goal in the field of education to support teachers, and particularly to support white teachers, to see racism as their problem or as my problem. Like, this is my problem, so what am I going to do about it? And this is, I think, part of the role of white anti-racist learning spaces, is saying racism is a white person problem. So if we're going to do something about it, it has to be white people. White people need to be taking action. This is not a problem that belongs to people of color. And in fact, it can't change unless white people do something about it. But if many of us were socialized the way I was socialized, we're going to need a lot of work. Because like I said, in my first anti-racist learning space, I needed a space to practice saying white and black. I mean, the sentences that are coming out of my mouth right now would not have come out of my mouth 20 years ago. Maybe 20 years ago, 22, not 22 years ago, because it was so hard for me to even just say those terms, because they were, I was taught that they were wrong. And sometimes I still feel very embarrassed after talking about race and racism, because I go to, well, did I say something wrong? Am I, maybe I don't know this. Maybe I'm out of my place saying this thing. But I think more often the guilt that I feel comes from just my socialization. I'm talking about something I was taught not to talk about. It's like the equivalent of if I was to I don't know, like snap my fingers at a waiter or something, or a waitress in a restaurant. Like, that's rude. I was taught not to do that. If I did that, I would be embarrassed. I'm embarrassed talking about race. And so for a white anti-racist learning space can help white people begin to unlearn that socialization that holds us back. First off, I think every meeting of every group like this should have an opening and closing. And so part of what I want to do is model how to have a group like this. Part of what happens when you have an opening and closing is you start to create a container for the group. So we're going to start out with some of the common questions after we do our opening. And then there's two main pieces I want to do. One is how to make this not just another book club. That's the first big piece. Then we're going to take a break to have some questions. So you'll have a little bit of small group time. We'll have some Q&A time. And then I'm going to share the white supremacy myths that often get in the way of us doing this work well together. It's like so common in what I would call white on white learning. And it doesn't always show up in white anti-racist learning spaces, but when white people are trying to help other white people learn about racism, these white supremacy myths routinely get in the way. And so I want to make sure to cover those. And then we're going to do a closing. All right. So why have a white anti-racist learning space? Like, why does it need to be white? Why do we need to have an all white space? So there's a lot of different reasons for this. I'm sure that you've heard. White people doing their own work. You often hear that expression. I've heard that expression from people of color. White people just need to do their own work. And so I remember thinking like, well, what is that exactly? What's my work? Part of my work, again, is the practice. Practice saying words I was taught not to say, practice seeing things that I was taught not to see. I was taught to be colorblind. So that's not just like I wasn't taught racial competency. Like, I was actually explicitly taught to pretend there was nothing happening, that race didn't matter when it did. Doing your own work means building skills and proficiency as well as humility. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's about humility being the kind of next step after proficiency. Humility, realizing that there will never be a time when I know everything about race and racism. It's a place to ask our dumb questions. And I don't think there's really a such thing as a dumb question, but there are certainly spaces in which I've thought this question would be a dumb question for me to ask here. I don't want to take up space. I don't want to admit that I don't know this, but a white anti-racist learning space should be a place for any questions. It should not be a place where I bring my dumb question and people say, that's not anti-racist, or there's something wrong with you for bringing that. That is exactly where we should bring our dumb questions. And then it's a place for us to see and name whiteness. I personally, I think there are ways to see and name and study whiteness that centers it. But mostly, I think that when we name it, when we talk about it, it decenters whiteness. It makes it, I think that whiteness kind of unconsciously gets centered in our society um, in a way that when we don't name it, it stays at the center. And so naming it and seeing it and practicing seeing whiteness is all part of a white anti-racist learning space. It's a place to get support because let's face it, if you're a white person learning anti-racism, it can be very lonely. You're taking anti-racist action, it can be lonely. Sometimes I even, I look at my colleagues of color who are like going off to their affinity space type thing, whether it's formal or informal, and think like, I'm so glad they have that space. And also, I wish I could be with them just for the company. But we need to have robust anti-racist learning spaces for white people that feel like they're life-giving, like that, like I can find company and support on my journey there. It's also a place where we are visible co-conspirators. So when I started my group in graduate school, I started it with like two other people. We put up signs. I didn't think anybody was going to come. I didn't really know how to do this in a public way. I had only done it for myself in a more private way before. And so what happened was amazing because the people who joined the group were from all over the university, people I never would have met if we hadn't had this group. It was like we were a holding space for white anti-racism in the university. And so we like I have good friends from that time who I wouldn't know if we hadn't done this. But at the same time, student of color groups could find us. And when they wanted to take actions or do certain things on campus, they would call us and say, like, could you partner with us in doing this? We did like a postcard campaign where we asked students to write their experiences of racism on postcards, and then we photocopied them and put them up all over the school. And then we had a big, like 2-hour meeting for everybody to come and talk about them. This was like before Instagram, I guess, before all the other ways that you would do that kind of thing. But it was like hashtag racism at GSE and then before hashtags. And then we put it all up. But it was a way for them to find us. Like, where are our white anti-racists or white people trying to be anti-racist? They're in that group. And it's also a place for role models. So one of the things Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about when she talks about white anti-racist identity development is how much we need role models because we don't really know what it looks like for white people to do this work. And so when you come to a group like this, you find role models in one another. Finally, it creates space for people of color. So particularly if a white anti-racist learning space happens at the same time as a person of color group, or other people of color affinity spaces, then it means there's not that question of like, why are they doing that? Why are they separate? There is also a place for white people to go. But at the same time, I really believe there's no reason for white people to gather as white people in exclusive spaces unless it's for the sake of anti-racist learning. So it's not like a white culture group or a white pride group. It's explicitly for unlearning racism. I have this arithmetic calculus metaphor on there that I use sometimes where I feel like people of color tend to have basically a calculus level understanding of racism. And I think that I used to think that people were like born with that or not born with that. That was like my biological understanding of racism. It was like, oh yeah, if you're a person of color, you're born understanding how it works. And what I realize now is it's not true at all. People who have a calculus level understanding of racism have been thinking about it most days of their lives. And so they just like, you show them the 3D, the three-dimensional, the like, what do you call it? The equation, and they can like draw the three-dimensional graph. You draw the equation for racism and they're like, I can see that exactly how it looks. With me, I feel like I'm maybe getting past arithmetic, but I still feel kind of like I can add, I can subtract, I have some vocabulary words, but like when it comes down to it, there's like when I listen to people of color talk about racism, I realize there's like so much nuance that I miss. And there's just that, like, on a daily basis, I find that my very gut instincts are not programmed to see it or to be afraid of racism. And so there's this way that I just have a different level of comprehension around it. And so part of this group is to up my opportunities for practice, but it's also to realize that, like, when you create space for people of color to do their own work around racism, they're going to have a different level conversation. We would never put arithmetic students with calculus level students and expect that to be a fun class for all the students, right? They're at different levels. They need different things. And so while it's not like all people of color know how to talk about race and all white people don't, I wouldn't say that's true at all. Um, there is this way that white people need different types of practice than people of color need. Um, and then, of course, the other thing that it does is it means white people can look at their bias. I can look at my bias. I can look at things I've done and said and want to kind of rethink and undo, or do differently. And it doesn't expose, it doesn't mean people of color don't have to like constantly witness my surfacing of all of that. So those are some reasons why we would have a space like this. Some questions that come up is like, isn't that segregation? And I think this usually comes up as a form of resistance. People don't think that we should be doing groups like this. But I always say, if somebody's if somebody asks, isn't that segregation? That's like the perfect person to recruit into your group. Because I'm like, oh, it's a white person who thinks they're witnessing racism and they speak up about it. You should be in the anti-racist learning space. It's not segregation. First of all, it's not. There's not policy around it. Usually, it's not legal. It's not mandatory, and it's usually not uh, like like everybody agrees to it. That, I think that's a huge part of it. It's temporary. The goal of having separate affinity spaces is to ultimately come back and be a stronger whole community. And it's really, I mean, I talk about it as like a pedagogical tool. It's just like pair work. Sometimes we break into pairs, sometimes we break into the chat, sometimes we break into same race groups. But there are other forms of affinity spaces in the world. Like the soccer team is an affinity space. The group for children whose parents have divorced is an affinity space. Affinity space is a space where you can kind of do the work you need to do, starting from without having to explain yourself or your identity to people who don't have that identity. How can we talk about race and racism without people of color? This was a big one for me. I grew up thinking you can only talk about race when people of color are around. And really, I was taught not to say anything in those conversations. I thought, like, basically, I don't know if I was taught this or if it was just kind of how I responded, but I would just like listen to people of color talk about racism, and then I would like nod and be empathetic and assume that my role was to just listen. And I didn't realize, it was somebody finally turned to me at one point in college and said, "What about you, Allie? What's your racial story?" And I'm like, I don't have a what are you talking about? I'm white. I don't have a racial story. I'm just here to listen to you all. And people were like, no, you have a racial story. What's your racial story? And so like when we have an all white space, we can't rely on people of color to tell us everything. We stop relying on our colleagues of color to be the teachers, to be the interpreters, to help us learn. But it's not that we're learning without people of color. People of color are still in the white anti-racist learning space in the form of books that they wrote to help white people learn, movies that they created, Instagram posts that they wrote. Maybe you have a panel that your institution created of students or clients of color talking about their experiences. Maybe you watch that and process it in the group. There's definitely an important role for having the voices of people of color who have volunteered their voices in that way. But it takes the onus off of people of color being always the ones to make themselves vulnerable and teach white people. It's also just an interesting question because it only gets asked when we have white anti-racist learning spaces. We don't ask it when we're sitting around at the hiring committee or the administrative council. And we're like, you know what? Everybody in this room is white. Okay, how can we talk about admissions without people of color? How can we talk about hiring a new science teacher without people of color? We should be asking that question all the time, but we only ask it when we're trying to do a white anti-racist learning space. Won't people think we're white supremacists? This came up in my group at in grad school all the time because people we'd leave the group and be like, I have to go home and tell my roommates I went to my white group. I'm not sure, not exactly sure how to say that. And it reminds me of a mentor of mine, Ancha Mateos, who said, I think white supremacists hijacked the term white. Like nobody else can identify as white because we, we don't want to be white supremacists, but we can't really do anything about racism or see ourselves in this racial dynamic if we don't name our whiteness. So, again, this is part of redefining whiteness. I mean, the very act of having a white space that's anti-racist is part of challenging the way that whiteness has always been defined. So there is gonna be some pushback, and people are gonna say, like, aren't you a white supremacist? And so you practice. You take that question and you practice. How do you respond to that? The last question people ask is, can we call it an affinity group? And I think it's a really good question. Sometimes for the purposes of planning, I have a school, I have affinity spaces at lunchtime for all the students, and white anti-racist group is one of those. They're all affinity spaces, so that's what I call it. But some people will say, if it's a group for people from the mainstream, if it's a group for the white people trying to be anti-racist, is it really affinity? Like, are they really bonding with each other based on the notion of this like shared identity of whiteness, or is it something else? And I think, in any anti-racist conversation, definitions can really trip us up. And I know a colleague of color said to me the other day, if my administration asks for one more meeting to sit down to debate the term racism and what do we mean by it, I'm going to quit my job. Because they couldn't do anything about racism because they had to define the meaning of racism so many hundreds of times and they weren't getting anywhere. So I think it's a good critique. I try to only use affinity when I feel like it will communicate to people. I think sometimes like white anti-racist learning space is like a mouthful. It doesn't always communicate everything I mean to say. And at the same time, I want to honor that critique of like, but it's not really white people getting together, being white together. It's more about like getting together to practice anti-racism. All right, how do you make sure it's not just another book club? So this comes from an article that I read this summer that some of you might have read. I'll probably send it out before our first coaching session called, it was an article, it was an op-ed by Trey Johnson, and it was called, When Black People Are in Pain, White People Join Book Clubs. I'm not lying here. When I saw it, I did not have the resilience to read it. I knew I needed to read it, but I was like, like not only am I a white person who joins book clubs when Black people are in pain, but I encourage other white people to do so. So what am I doing wrong here? And I emailed it to myself. I knew I had to read it, but I was just like in that place where it's like, I can't read this right now. So I read it a couple days later. And when I read it, I thought, yes, this is what we're talking about. This is why we want our white anti-racist learning spaces to be intentional. We want it to be more than just another book club. And so the next few things I'm going to share are some of the ways we make sure that it's not just another book club. The first one is having explicit goals, both for the club or the group, but also for individuals. So to have people at the beginning of the time together, set their own goals, and to give them time and partners, at the second meeting or the third meeting to check in. How are your goals going? What support do you need? So it's not about like forcing them to like meet certain benchmarks. It's just about honoring that people are coming with particular goals and giving them space to be accountable to those goals, just as you would with like a therapist. You came here wanting to talk about this. How are we doing? Are we meeting those goals? What else do you need? Another thing is shifting from the notion of white friends to white allies. Now, these can be overlapping categories. I count all of my white allies as friends. I'm not saying you can't be friendly or friends. In fact, somebody in a white anti-racist learning group that I facilitated 4 workshops for them, and they're big justice-oriented nonprofit in the U.S. And I supported I facilitated 4 groups for them because their anti-racist learning space was not generative. There was a lot of silence, there was a lot of mistrust, there was a lot of fear. And in the 3rd session that I was leading, one of the women said to me, "I didn't know we could be nice to each other." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's like fundamental. We got to this is where you get your support, because if you're not getting support here, then any support you need emotionally around this, you're going to try to get from people of color. And that becomes a drain on them. Not that you don't have friends of color who would be willing to do that for you, but like this needs to be a place where you get support. Um, and so my white allies are also my friends. But I have some white friends who are not allies. I have some white friends who are like, if I tell them I did something racist, they're like, "Oh, no," like I can remember this one friend. We were on a walk together, and I told her that I called one of my black classmates by another black classmate's name, and she was like, "Allie, no, that is not racist. You just have such high standards for yourself. You need to just let yourself off the hook sometimes, and like don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal." And in my head, of course, I spent a little time trying to convince her it was a big deal. But in my head, I was thinking, you know what? This person is my friend, but they're not my ally. I have other white people who I call when I want to be holding myself accountable, when I want to be able to process an event like this, who are going to say, my allies aren't going to be like, "Oh, Allie, you're bad." Mm-mm. My allies are going to be like, "Oh, I hate it when that happens. I've done that before. Ooh, what do you think happened? Like, what were the circumstances? How could you stop it from happening again? What do you want to process? How are you feeling?" That they're going to help me process all the shame I'm feeling, all the frustration, all the confusion, and help me like come out and do better next time. And I think a group like this needs to be full of allies, where we practice allyship to each other, and not just a book club is more like we get together, we read the book, it's nice, we're friendly, but are we helping each other meet our goals and be accountable? So it will include self-awareness building. I'll say more about that in a second. Reflection and action. There will be time for taking notes, for maybe some writing, 5 minutes, 10 minutes of writing by myself. And then you often will have an accountability partner of color. So this can look different for everybody. The first group I was in that was just like my friends and family, we didn't have an accountability partner of color except through the classes we were taking, books we were reading, friends that we had outside of the group. But it wasn't very formal. Usually in an institution, if you have like in my graduate school, we had a white anti-racist learning space, and we were visible. We wanted somebody who was a person of color we could be accountable to. And I didn't want to start the group without having that, but it meant I wasn't starting it. I wasn't starting it, on and on. And finally, I told somebody the problem, and they said, "Just start it, then you'll be visible. And then you'll see who is interested in the group. And maybe you can invite them to be an accountability partner." And what ended up happening was the person who ran the student of color group was a good friend of mine, and I was running the white anti-racist learning group. And I asked her if she would be willing to just check in with me every once in a while about what we were doing, and whether, to hold us accountable, to tell us if there was anything we were doing that was actually hurting students of color at the grad school, or that was not what we should be doing. And again, that's where so much of our partnership came from, and our co-hosting events. In general, you want to make sure your accountability partner is not a volunteer, that especially if you're at a school, and this is another, people of color end up doing so much extra labor at schools that's unpaid. And so you want to kind of, if it, like maybe this is part of their job description, maybe if they have fewer clubs they have to run, or one less class or something, that they're not just an accountability partner because they're a person of color. They have some expertise and some desire for this to be their role. Every meeting should include, again, like I said, an opening and a closing. And this is all of what I'm sharing here is about building a strong container so that your group can do deep, good work together. Every meeting should include a facilitator. It doesn't have to be an outside facilitator, and it doesn't always have to be you. Um, but what we found was that we were a group of white people who were really skilled at not talking about race. And so it wasn't enough always for us to just like show up and be like, so what do you think about the book? It really helped to say, okay, for this night or this day, you are going to be the facilitator and you come with a plan for an opening, a plan for closing, a little bit of an agenda, some discussion questions or some activities. And again, you can rotate the facilitator, but there should be somebody who takes it on. There should be some norms, discussion norms, and group purpose. The group purpose is something that I think is useful to write at the beginning and to help all of the group members decide together, what are we doing here? But the group purpose should almost be on every flyer. So if you're advertising this publicly, which you might not be, which is okay too, it's one thing to have the name like white students confronting racism, but it's another thing to have 3 or 4 sentences that describe what the purpose of the group is. And that should be public because that helps, because people are going to wonder, is this segregation? Are you starting a white group? Because is this like a white pride group, or like, is this a white supremacist group? And you want to do as much as possible to help people understand why white people are meeting with other white people. Every meeting should include pair work. So like I said before, the main thing I got out of maybe it's not the only thing, but one of the primary things I get out of these groups is opportunities to practice talking. And so every time you put people in pairs, everyone in the room is talking. And so they're practicing talking about race. It's amazing to me watching my son play piano. He's been taking piano for like 3 weeks. And every time he plays, his teacher, it's like the first lesson, his teacher had him playing piano. And it occurred to me like, yeah, you don't learn how to play piano without sitting down and touching the keys. Pair work helps make it possible for people not to hold back in the conversation, but to be talking, to be practicing. The fastest way to build safety in groups is to put people in pairs. Because once you put me in a pair, I know there's one other person who knows me and gets me, and I know and get one other person. And then there should be time to respond to 2 prompts. And of course, this can take many different creative roads, but essentially you want to make sure people are asking themselves, how does this make you feel? And how does this impact you as a white person? So if I'm reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and, it's just a book group, then I'm going to be like talking about the book. Maybe I'll talk about how it makes me feel because it's kind of inescapable with that book, but I want to have time to really think about the feelings, the emotions that come up, because our emotions are so often our guide to action. But I have really been taught, especially in like academic discussions, to cut myself off from emotions, to cut myself off from my gut. So how does this make you feel? And then how does it impact you as a white person? This is a history of mass incarceration in the US. It's by and large not about white people, but a lot of the history she's talking about is history that happened during my lifetime. What was happening for me? What was happening for people in my family? What was our interaction with law enforcement like during that time? How did these laws benefit me? These laws that created mass incarceration. So those 2 prompts should be a part of the work that the group is doing. And then finally, time to revisit personal goals, to keep checking in about that. So this container for a meeting is automatically going to help you to have some ritualized engagement that can make you a group that can do some deeper work together. But also that takes it beyond just the book group. So I'm going to share another framework for thinking about this, which is about racial competency. All right. So the other thing about taking this beyond a book group and not just having it be a book group, but having it be an anti-racist learning space is about framing our process around building racial competency. So this is a framework that comes from counseling psychology that says first of all, racial competency is part of a 21st century education. It's something that people today are expected to have in colleges, in graduate school, in every job. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to this year from all kinds of different lines of work, basically saying like, I need to know this stuff and I don't know this stuff. Nobody expected me to know in grad school. Nobody expected me to know this when I got my job. But now, people running summer camps and people running law firms who are like, I don't know anything about race and I should. So this is something that we should all be working on. And I say that especially for teachers who are, I know sometimes it's a struggle to convince kids and their families why they need to know this stuff. But I just look at all the students who didn't get in, whose college admissions were revoked because they didn't know, because they were using racial slurs online, for example. And I just think like, what they have no skill, no knowledge about the impact that they're having. Racial competency is something that can really support students to have better judgment and to support one another to have better judgment. So this is what it looks like. It's not just knowledge. If we were to stay with knowledge, that would be the book club model. So we have a book club. We read the book. We know what was in the book. Racial competency is the idea that it goes beyond knowledge, that it's also self-awareness, skills, and action. So this is what they say in counseling psychology. Racial competency is the knowledge, self-awareness, skills, and action to recognize racism and intervene with it. That's all we're doing here. We're recognizing racism and we're intervening with it, both at the both inside ourselves and outside ourselves. So in two places, inside me and outside me. This is just an example I use that you're welcome to use with your groups of like, what could it look like if we're racially competent? And it, in some ways it minimizes it because there's so much that's possible. But this was a poster that was put up by the Red Cross in 2016 and then recalled. This is from an article in the Washington Post. And it was recalled because essentially all the people who are not cool at the pool are people of color or could be people of color. It's hard because they're all cartoons. But when I was in high school, I don't think I could have said like, oh, look, this is really problematic because there's this, all the people of color are being treated as not cool as the pool. And it's really consistent with a lot of really negative and untrue stereotypes about people of color. Because I think, honestly, I would have looked at this and I would have said, oh, wow, that's good. They portrayed a racially diverse swimming pool. That's, I think that's where I was in high school. Like, oh, that's nice. That's important. And so when somebody's racially competent, again, they can recognize what the problem is. They can recognize racism. They could sit at this marketing table at the Red Cross and see what's happening here. And then they can intervene with it. They have the skills to be able to say in a way people will hear, we can't publish this. This is going to be embarrassing and it's not right. And it's not the idea that we're trying to promote as the Red Cross. Another skill for white people, white co-conspirators, is to amplify that message, to look at this. Maybe I don't see it. Maybe I don't say anything, but I hear somebody else at the table say, oh, there's something wrong with that poster. And then I amplify, I see it then because they pointed out and I'm not, I think again, early in my development, I might've felt like defensive that I didn't see it or feel, or I wasn't the one to get it. Or maybe like, you're talking about race and that's racist. Why are you bringing that up? And I've sat at lots of tables where somebody tries to bring up something in a racially conscious way and other people shoot it down for any of those reasons. But another option for intervention is to amplify that person's voice. And so racial competency is recognition and intervention. And intervention can even happen after somebody's already intervened by amplifying it and supporting what they're saying. Again, so to break it down further, knowledge, self-awareness, skills, and action. That's what we're looking for. So this is like the book club stuff, but it also takes it beyond the book club. Let's as a group, let's go to a conference together. Let's find role models who are white and anti-racist and learn more about them. But this is like the resource gathering piece. And it's the part where we join together to get the knowledge. I don't want to sell the knowledge part. The knowledge part's really important. Obviously, we can't leave it at that, but we are primed on a daily basis to take in racist messaging from our society. So we get racist priming on a daily basis. And so we need anti racist priming on a daily basis. And when I have a group that I'm reading with or I'm listening to podcasts with or whatever, that is my anti racist priming. And it just helps me stay on the path. The second piece, again, self awareness. So bringing into the group opportunities to take the implicit attitudes test and talk about it together. Checking in one on one with your buddy about your goals and also about your feelings. How is this making you feel? There are lots of books that have exercises that are in the books. So if you read a chapter, I know Debbie Irving's book, Waking Up White, has tons, every chapter there's exercises. The Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys, we purposely put in exercises after every chapter. And of course, nobody ever does the exercises, right? I often skip the exercises, but that's what an anti-racist learning space can be for, is like to do the exercises together. And then journaling, and then the white racial identity development frameworks. Skills can look a lot of different ways. Part of the skill you get from a group like this is the network of allies that you're building by building community in those meetings. There's another skill called support confront that I'll go over more of later. That's a skill for intervening with other white people. That's like the fundamental, for me, that's the fundamental skill. You support the person and the comment that you support the person and their intention. You see them wanting to get better. You see them wanting to learn. You find something in them to affirm. It's like, I think about coaching writing and how sometimes you're like looking at a 8th grade essay and thinking, I don't know if there's anything in here I can affirm. But there's like, so you have to affirm them before you give them critique, or they're not going to hear the critique. You support them, you affirm them, and then you confront the behavior. And just like with a kid, it's not the kid who's bad, it's the behavior that's bad. Okay, so I have a white person in front of me trying to be anti-racist. They say something offensive. I need to support all their good intention and why they're here, and then confront the behavior, confront the comment. And this is, too often we only support or we only confront. We're so busy supporting and building a network of allies that we don't ever get to the confront part, or we just confront and we don't offer any support because we don't know we're allowed to be nice to each other. So support confront for me is really fundamental. It's like the thing we need to practice in every meeting, in every interaction, because it's also the skill I use when I'm talking to people who are in power, when I need to talk to somebody about creating change. Support confront it always comes back to that. When I'm trying to intervene with another white person and their racism, that's what I go to. Access your full compass. This is related to the compass in courageous conversations, about looking at whether when we enter race conversations, where do we enter from? Is it from a place of action, a place of feeling, a place of belief, or a place of intellect? Like, are we trying to just engage about the definition of racism? Are we all feeling, and just recognize that and look at whether you can balance it out with other aspects of the compass. Taking feedback and finding feedback, getting it and then taking it in is a skill. We'll talk more about white group level behaviors during the coaching sessions, but recognizing that as a white person, I was socialized a lot like a lot of other middle-class white people. And we have these white group level behaviors, these things we do at the group level that can be oppressive, like not noticing race, not noticing when a group is all white, undermining a person of color's authority, for example. There's a lot of different things that happen at the group level. We'll talk more about that, but recognizing and stopping those is a skill. And then supporting in, dumping out, that's another skill for working in multiracial groups, recognizing that I don't want to, this actually comes from, it's a theory of grief, that if let's say I have a friend who's lost her husband, he died, and I want to support her. So I'm in the second circle of friends. She has her family around her. I'm in the second circle. Anybody closer to her than I am, I'm going to support them. But I'm going to have my own feelings about this too. So I'm going to dump my feelings on my sister who doesn't even know this person. I'm going to dump my feelings on somebody who's in a circle further outside of me. So if you can picture those concentric circles, I want to support in and not burden people of color with my feelings about racism and dump out to other people who can hear it. It's a skill of kind of recognizing, I might have a lot of sadness about racism, but if I'm in a multiracial workshop, that might not be the right place for me to share all my sadness because that's not a space, that wasn't a space created for me to do all my emotional processing. That said, a lot of people struggle with this question of like white people's tears. White people have tears, and they sometimes take up space in multiracial workshops crying. And while I think we need to figure out if we're in that moment trying to take up space for ourselves that is actually for the larger group. I think white people do need to cry about racism. It's part of accessing our feelings. But again, that's another role for white anti-racist learning spaces. That's where white people's tears belong. That's where our rage and our tears should show up, where we should be able to process those. Because it's not about not crying about racism. It's about not taking up space unfairly. And then finally, action. Okay. So, one of my mentors, Dr. Frederick Bryant, said, for white people, self awareness is a form of action. He said, if more white people would just be more self aware, the world would be different. And this is about recognizing that even when this is my life and work, or even when I lead the White Anti-Racist Learning Group, there's still so much more self-awareness that I need to work on. That is a constant practice. And never feeling like, well, I don't have to do that because I've got this all figured out. There's so many woke white people who still need to figure it out. So if self-awareness was our first form of action, always, there's a lot that wouldn't happen that's harmful. But then what else do we do? I believe the answers are often very clear. They're coming from people of color in our institution, and for some reason we don't hear them. We don't hear the answers. And I think it's because this is what my colleague Eleonora has taught me, that we somehow go into, we see the critiques as a threat, and white people often go into fight, flight, freeze mode. And so I'm afraid of the feedback. I'm protecting against the feedback. And so I can't be in deep empathetic connection to the feedback, because I feel like, oh no, that it threatens who I think I am or who I'm trying to be. I can't just sit and listen and then take action based on what I hear. As far as action is concerned, I really encourage people to just start, create a draft and do one thing. And maybe it will be wrong. And then you'll get feedback that you did the wrong thing and you can do better next time. And the problem with that is that we get feedback that we did the wrong thing, and then we feel like, oh my God, I should just give up. Well, that's freeze. Or we feel like, I just want to quit this. I just want to wash my hands of this. That's flight. Like, we get feedback that we did the wrong thing and we can't take it. And so we're terrified of doing anything because it might be the wrong thing, when there's no perfect thing. There's not. Racism is really complex, it's really messy, and it's really terrible. So there are lots of right things, and there's probably something wrong with every right thing that we could do. And if we didn't get the feedback, if we didn't produce the draft, we wouldn't know what we need to know in order to get better. So again, use the space to practice. How are you going to respond? How are you going to respond when people say this or say that? And do some role plays. Talk to student of color groups or faculty groups of color to find out, what do people in your institution want more of from white people who are trying to be anti-racist. And then, open yourself up to all the opportunities to hear from people of color, and what it is that you could be doing. So the action steps are really rooted locally. I mean, obviously, there's always we could give money to Black Lives Matter. That's always valuable. There's always things that could be valuable. There's legislation that needs to be supported. but there's also real actionable local stuff that will be that could transform your institution, and that you probably have more power to contribute to, than many of the other things. I want to share 6 myths that show up in white anti-racist learning spaces that make it hard for us to do what we're there to do, which is all the stuff we've talked about in the first hour. So these are the 6 myths, and I'm going to go through them one by one and then talk about how they show up in groups and what we can do about them. These are myths that come from living in a white supremacist society, a society in which we have always had a racial hierarchy. I mean, just to kind of simplify, sometimes we say white supremacy and people are like, what are you talking about? We've always had a racial hierarchy in the US, and people haven't always been at the same place in the racial hierarchy, but we've always put white people at the top and Black people at the bottom. That is what the racial hierarchy, that is what it means to live in a white supremacy, where white people have, not all uniformly and in the same way, but where white people have access to resources and opportunities first, where Black people have access to resources and opportunities and even humanity last. And then, of course, there are lots of racial groups in between, and we know that race shifts over time, and so that's not always been the same. But that's what it means to live in a white supremacy. And living in a white supremacy as a white person means I'm susceptible to some of this mythology. So I'm going to go through those. The first one I talked about with my own family: be colorblind. Don't talk about race. If we are colorblind, the status quo stays the same. So it's in the interest of white supremacy for people to be colorblind, because then we can't name whiteness, we can't name the racial hierarchy, we can't talk about racism, and we can't change it. And so we have this sense that, like, somehow, if I work hard enough, I should be able to do it right, and I should be able to do it perfectly. And I know for many people from marginalized groups, it's like, that's not true. That myth has never been true. If you work hard, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get ahead. And so don't try to be perfect. And this idea that, so I carry this into my anti-racism with me as I want to get it perfect. I can't do anything until I get it right. It has to be right. And so then I don't do anything because I can't get it perfect. Compete and win. So we live in a very individualistic society in which we are taught to compete, and that's how we do that. I mean, I can see it in education as early as kindergarten. Kids are competing to, competition is like one of the main motivations in classrooms, in some classrooms, not all classrooms. This ends up shaping white anti-racist learning spaces where white people are competing against each other to be the most anti-racist. And I can remember at one point in my group in grad school, my friend Sue Bickerstaff was like, oh, I just figured it out. It's not about me being the best anti-racist in the room. It's about ending racism. It's not about me. But it was like we were in these unconscious ways competing against each other. And then and we do this with anti-racist. Like, I'm the anti-racist and you just said something racist, so I need to clobber you because I'm anti-you. And we need to reframe this. Like, no, I'm not anti-you. We're both white people socialized in this country in really messed up ways. I want to be anti-racist. So if you say something racist, I should reach out to you in a way that supports you to walk with me on an anti-racist path together. And I don't look better if I make another white person look bad. The question is not whether I make them look good or bad or correct them or don't in the moment. The question is, do they learn in an effective way that what they said was offensive and then want after the conversation to keep learning? That's an effective intervention. The fourth one is the myth of internalized dominance, that I know the best way to do things, even in anti-racism. So white people sometimes, and myself included, absolutely, I'll bring this into my anti-racism work. Even Frederick Bryant, the person, my mentor, we even had a conversation once where he was like, Allie, it really seems like you want me to do this your way. And like, if I did this your way, then we'd have two people doing it a white woman's way. Like, the reason you need to work with me is because I do it differently from you. And he was like, our different styles are what makes this work, actually. But my sense of internalized dominance was like, we got to look good. We got to do this well. We got to get people on board. That's another myth. We should think about this and we shouldn't feel about it. We shouldn't have any feelings about it. So I was really trained, again, I said this earlier, to think about racism and to intellectualize it, but not to feel about it. You know, sometimes with racism, I hear a lot of stories from families of color about the racism their kids are experiencing. And I don't feel it the way I think I should in my gut. And then this one time, someone told me that the gym teacher at the school my daughter was going to be going to was, they said something about like, he's really creepy. I was like, what do you mean he's creepy? And they said, oh, he's creepy with girls. And that was that I felt my blood turn to ice when they said that. And I automatically went into action mode. I'm going to move. I'm going to sell the house. I'm going to get out of here. I don't want to be in a place where the gym teacher is creepy with girls. Right. So I could feel that happened in my veins, but I hadn't felt that before, in spite of all the families of color telling me stories about their students' experiences with racism. So again, cultivating that capacity to feel the impact of racism is part of our work. The myth that race is real. This is a complicated one. So we know that race is a social construction. Race was made up. I'm no more white, and my colleague Tony's no more Black than like, those are categories. They're not real. There's this whole history of science and politics and legal policy that have kind of conjured race as real, but we know that it's all made up, that biologically we are fundamentally all just human beings. And yet race has been constructed in the US for so long that we can't undo racism without talking about race. And so just like Santa Claus, Santa Claus is also a social construction, but it doesn't mean we don't have to deal with it. Like most of us have to deal with them, whether we like it or not, even if we don't celebrate Christmas. So race is a social construction, and yet we have to deal with it in order to do anything about racism. So these are the myths. The myth that race is real is really important here, because white supremacists today, active white supremacist groups, believe that race is real, that it's biological, that it's encoded in our skin, that it's in our bodies, that white people are biologically superior to people of color, and that we're capable of different things. White people are just naturally more intelligent. That is fundamental to white supremacist thinking. So it needs to be fundamental to anti-racist thinking that we recognize the socially constructed nature of race. All right, so how do we counter these myths as they show up in our groups? We've talked about all of these. The fourth one, racial talk versus racist talk to combat colorblindness. Differentiate between racial talk and racist talk. So often kids feel like anytime you would name race or name somebody's skin color, that it's racist. You're bringing up race, so therefore you're racist. We need to help kids differentiate between what's racial talk, which allows us to talk about race, talk about how it impacts our lives, to confront racism, to dismantle racial hierarchies, and then racist talk, which reinforces racial hierarchies or stereotypes or demeans. In terms of countering the myth that we should be perfect, make mistakes, model making mistakes, cheer for people when they take a risk, even when they get things wrong, and encourage drafts. One of my mentors tells me that anti-racism is like figure skating. She says, if you're a figure skater, you have to know how to fall and recover. You don't learn how to do a triple axel the first time you do the triple axel, right? You do it like 1,000 times and you fall 1,000 times. And then on the 1,001st time, you do the triple axel. So in terms of anti-racism, we need to be able to fall, make mistakes, and recover. And that's hard to say because people of color are ready for us to stop making mistakes. They're ready for us to know how to do this yesterday. And yet that's not how people learn. And so as much as we can use groups like this to make mistakes and not shame each other when we make mistakes, the further along we'll be. So instead of competing, lean towards each other. Instead of leaning away, somebody says something racist, and so I kind of distance myself like, oh, I'm not that kind of white person. Lean towards that person. Recognize that we have common socialization as white people. Connect to them, find ways to connect to them, support them, don't shame them. Help them take their next step. Their next step is not going to be my next step, but help them take their own next step. Share your vulnerabilities, acknowledge you don't do everything perfectly. And remember, I mean, Resmaa Menahem, who's a Black trauma specialist from Minneapolis, says this is work that's going to take 8 generations. So none of us is going to complete this work in our lifetimes. It's going to take 8 generations. So again, and it's been going on for 500 years. We're joining something that's bigger than us, and we need to strategize about it for the long term, not just for today, not just for this particular interaction. In terms of internalized dominance, naming it, remind people of both and the value of having multiple different perspectives, that it doesn't have to be my way or your way, that it could actually possibly be both ways, that there's like, racism is so big, we actually need multiple roads towards confronting it. There's not just like one way that's the right way, and that we need a network of supportive accountability to help us find the way. In terms of feeling, naming how much we don't feel, helping people acknowledge that and learn to notice when they're avoiding their feelings. One of the things I do with newspaper articles is if something, sometimes I'll find myself scrolling past titles that might make me emotional. And instead of just like scrolling past them, dig in depth into one story. Find the story that is emotional for you, and then find other stories on other platforms about the same thing, about the same event, and dig into it. Find the people's names, learn more, get one-on-one, get proximate to that story instead of just doom scrolling all the bad things that happened this week. And then like sit with those feelings and recognize when you're being led by your thoughts rather than your feelings, and see if you can make that shift. And then finally, remembering that we're not actually white. For those of us who are white, we're not, and none of us is actually our racial group. We're all constructed as that. But also, if I'm not white, I mean, if whiteness is a social construction, it is real, because social constructions are real. They have a huge impact on our lives. But I can change what whiteness means. Again, we can opt to make whiteness mean something different than what it means. But we need to learn about how it was constructed, what it has meant historically. And then we need to continue to recognize race is not real, but racism is real.
As you wrap up this video, I just want to thank you for being a part of this workshop and for putting the time and energy in to think about how to lead your white anti-racist learning space in a way that is effective and supportive of the people who are in it, so that they can be supportive and effective in their work as anti-racist white people. My hope is that we do this work well in ways that generate more courageous and more competent white people who can stand up and be counted in these times. Thank you for the effort, because I do believe it's worth it. Just one note about my other work is that I'm an educator. All of my writing is really a response to questions that I have asked or that other educators have asked me, such as, how does white culture look? What does white culture look when in schools, for example? Or tell us more about the stages of racial identity development. I need a reading on that. All of my writing tries to address some of the common questions that come up for white educators who are working to develop a racially competent practice. So if you're interested in hearing any other talks from me or looking at my writing, you can find all of that at my website, alliemichael.org. Thanks again for all your good work, and I look forward to crossing paths with you out in the world.